Shannon Parrish. I'm the curator in the Photographic History Collection. I've had the privilege of working with Peter while he's been here in residence with his fellowship. A day like today has been a long time coming. For today's colloquium speaker, Peter Domankiewicz, to offer you these early motion picture histories required the work of many people across time and across the institution. This assertion, of course, is not unique to the photographic history collections, but Peter's fellowship highlights what it means for us as museum workers to persist in caring for and stewarding objects so that when the dynamic, prepared researcher comes along, they're able to hit the mat running and swim deeply. Peter is here on fellowship from De Montfort University in Leicester, working on his dissertation, reconsidering the work and inventions of William Friese-Greene and their contribution to early cinema history. It's a debate whether British will still be in or not. Yeah. His fellowship is funded by the British Arts and Humanities Research Council. If you think it was already a lot of bureaucracy for fellowships, add in the UK and international visa bureaucracy. Fortunately, the Office of International Relations streamlined that as much as they possibly could. That Peter knew what to ask about in photo history can largely be put down to Ryan Lentelman, who some dozen years ago was prompted by Charlie McGovern, a former NMAH curator who was Ryan's professor at William and Mary. Ryan took up his suggestion to write about the early motion picture history collection. He then spent several years here at NMAH to create organized and detailed finding aids that have been the bedrock of Peter's access to the collection. So thank you, Ryan, for all of that work. But I also marvel at the luck and tenacity and foresight of U.S. National Museum curators. Of course, they preceded us, those curators, as they watched a new image technology emerge beginning some 120 years ago. Needless to say, there is something to be said about collecting in the wake of groundbreaking moments. And of course, Peter will say something about that today. Those collections and records tell a host of stories that deepen, contradict, and expand what is often the published history. Peter's research resources are held in the Archive Center, for which David Haberstich is a member. PHC storage here in the building, but also PHC storage off-site. We've made trips to MSC and Silver Hill, where Sherry and Jarvis uncrated 6-foot-tall apparatus for us. From SI Cold Storage, I recalled 3 rare historical films, and SI archivists have also pointed Peter to a bevy of institutional and collection records. Peter's ability to be successful here is due to his own background that led him to work on his dissertation. He came to the topic after many years as a filmmaker, actor, writer, and director. Check out his IMDb page and watch the trailer for Tea and Sangria. Not all practitioners make good historians, but Peter does. You can check out his unique brand of storytelling and historical research at his website, friesegreene.com. But before you go off to those websites, please welcome Peter as he makes his first contribution to lifting up objects and histories from the Photographic History Collection and the Smithsonian to put them into the public, into new scholarship, a transnational conversation, and even to our own realm of knowledge here at NMAH. Peter, take it away.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is definitely walking in the footsteps of other people. And I said to Shannon one time, I don't know, when we were struggling to find something, and then we found it. I said, well, at the end of the day, it's kind of extraordinary that things are donated 125 years ago. You can still track every step up to where, with all the changes and new museums being built and stores being changed and all of this, you can track all these things through all these generations. Because without that, of course, there's no point having things if you can't find them. And we've been finding a lot of stuff. All right, well, who am I? I am a filmmaker, as Shannon said, sort of turned weirdly film historian. Having used all sorts of different formats down across the years, I became somewhat obsessed with how it all started. Like, how did we begin to have moving pictures at all? And became sort of fixated on what I refer to as the cusp of cinema. It's when people were thinking about the idea of somehow trying to capture movement in real life, but didn't know how necessarily, or had limited resources to do it, but they were kind of trying to dream it up out of thin air with what was around. which when you go back in time was just early photography on glass plates, not necessarily such a promising medium for capturing hundreds and thousands of images, one after another. So let me start. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to share my screen. Excuse me whilst I bumble. I'm not so used to it, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to get rid of all of you and get rid of all of that and put that right down there where it's out of the way, and instead show you some of this. So I'd like to start with, the single most important artifact, in film history that I've encountered in the time that I've been here. And that is, sorry, just give me one moment. I'm fiddling with something here. I'm fiddling with a disobedient camera, believe it or not. That's what I'm fiddling with. Let me just restart it. The most important artifact, in some ways, for some people, might be this. It is John McClane's badge that he was wearing before he took on those appalling terrorists in Nakatomi Towers with somebody who, well, a remarkable resemblance to Bruce Willis. Now, that film, like so many films, was shot on 35mm film, as indeed most films had been up to then and continued to be for quite a while afterwards, up until relatively recent times when we've gone very digital. But I feel I should perhaps explain what film really is. It's this stuff. This is some 35mm film negative. It is literally a transparent, flexible, plasticky substance which can be rolled up, has holes up the side to help move it through the camera, move it through projectors. It's covered in chemicals which react to light. So when the light hits it, it turns dark when it's been developed. So as you will see here, the sky is dark and the sea is bright. But if you put two pieces of film together and print one onto another, you get the reverse. Ta-da! Sky is light, sea is dark, and you have a positive print. That is the essence of making film, and that is the essence of 35mm. But 35mm is just a format we kind of ended up with for commercial reasons, for very early commercial reasons. The earliest of all, which was this. This is how film was first seen, not projected on a screen. This is how 35mm film was first seen. It was in something called the kinetoscope. And if I zoom in here a bit, you can see, it actually says, you can see Edison's latest invention, the kinetoscope. And this here is a kinetoscope parlor, where you could come and you could look at a bunch of them. Why a bunch of them? Well, because each one showed a film not even 20 seconds long. So you'd pay a bit of money for each film that you watched. Perhaps it's unsurprising that when these became popular, people began to look at them, or some people began to look at them and go, yeah, but wouldn't it be better if we could see them up on a big screen rather than having to do this, which is literally how people stood to look into them, craning your neck over like this to look down a little hole. Wouldn't it be better up on a screen? And then commercially speaking, lots of people could see it at once. You can make lots more money. And quite a lot of people thought these things. Now, I want to place you in time a bit here. The kinetoscope came into public view in 1894. A film industry, as we might think about it, which is to say there were different equipment, there were different companies all competing in a new field, kind of kicked off in 1896. So that's sort of the marker of projected film really starting to catch off, right? So what I'm looking at is what happened before that, from about 1880, 1885 onwards. Because as I say, back then, all you had was a sheet of glass. That was all William Friese-Greene really had to work with. There he is as a young chap. He was a working class guy who had learnt photography and decided to put his wife's name with his own and become Friese-Greene instead of just Willie Green, which is who he'd been before. Started a chain of photographic studios, made him a load of money, and he spent really all the profits on inventing, especially this idea of inventing moving pictures. And this was because in his earlier days in Bath, he'd met this slightly strange looking figure, John Rudge, with his vacuum pump, who was also thinking about trying to make photographs somehow move. But all that they really had was glass plates. So what Rudge and Friese-Greene together were using little glass plates, just teensy-weensy little glass plates, onto which you could take a series of 4 pictures. And I should stress, these are posed pictures. These aren't taken in real time. So the plate's about this big. The images are about 35 millimeters wide, each of them, weirdly enough. And by dissolving one into another with a type of lantern, they hope to make things move. And it probably looked something like this. So, posed pictures, just 4, and yet, you know, there's a kind of life in there, isn't there? Let's have a look at another one. But William Friese-Greene, as he became more successful and moved up to London and had more studios, had his eye on something bigger. And with a civil engineer called Mortimer Evans, who was not anybody who worked in the field of photography or anything like that at all, but he must have got to know somehow, they created a camera. Here it is. It's at its biggest dimension, no more than 10 inches. So it's reasonably compact. And that's there its insides. And it took, as you can see, a strip of fairly wide film to create images which were 2.5 inches square, more or less. And we don't have a lot of those images that have survived. Here's a frame from one film, might be on Haverstock Hill in London. This is just reproduced from another publication. Here's a tiny fragment of slightly decaying celluloid to also give you an idea, taken by the Serpentine. And this camera certainly technically was capable of taking 10 frames a second. He carried on experimenting after going bust, and in the early 1890s was certainly working with another camera, punching his own holes in the film. This is a little film of the King's Road in the early 1890s. So this is before kind of movies at all were being kind of officially shot, as it were. This is just an experiment taken outside the photographic studio he then had, well, rather in his wife's name, because he was bankrupt. So that's the guy I've been studying, but he has bounced me off into wondering, well, I mean, a major part of my PhD is I want to take an international view of things. And that's part of the reason that I'm here in the National Museum of American History, is rather than being in a little silo of looking at everything that's going on in Britain, it's like, well, what was going on elsewhere? What was similar? What was different? What might have influenced what? Because in certain ways, Friese-Greene did have an influence. It's just not perhaps the influence previous historians have talked about much. He did affect various things that went on, and Edison was aware of his work. So I'm going to talk about 3 people. One of them for a slightly longer time, and 2 of them pretty quickly, and try and get through this as fast as I can. It'll be action-packed, I'm telling you. And I want to talk, first of all, about this guy, Wallace Gould Levison. He was a scientist, principally a mineralogist, also a chemist in Brooklyn. Did a lot of work with the Brooklyn Institute. I have to show you another picture of him just because it's a great picture, not that it really matters for my talk. Where is he? There he is. There he is at home in his study. Look at that. Above all, I want you to take a very close look at that pipe. That is quite a pipe, that man. I love the way it's under his arm whilst he's reading a book. And if we move across, you can see all those drawers, which I'm guessing the kind of drawers you might put samples of minerals and rocks in, maybe other things. I don't know. Anyway, aside from all of this, he was a very keen and active photographer. And with a guy called George Brainerd, they came up with a kind of snapshot camera. snapshot camera that was designed to be somewhat disguised, quite small. Now, this snapshot is an easy word to say now. At the time, it was an entirely new concept. The idea that you might be able to take one picture after another quickly. By quickly, I mean maybe more than once in a minute, for instance. And that you might be able to do it discreetly and with something small and relatively simple to use. These were new ideas. There had probably only been one product of that type on the market in America when they were working with this. And although it was not perhaps a major success in and of itself, Brainerd and Levison took some interesting pictures, which were just, in a sense, this is street photography. Here's like a candy man out on the street in Brooklyn, African-American family on the beach in Coney Island, not the kind of image you would see a lot of. And this intrigues me at the zoo. It particularly intrigues me because you can see it's shot from a low angle, like somebody's holding something down low. And I've got a feeling he's photographing somebody with one of their cameras or something very like it. That guy's looking into a little viewfinder, I think, and taking a photograph. So this is kind of a new type of photography. Now, Brainerd died, and Levison carried on doing things. And one of the people that we know Levison met was Edward Muybridge, who probably most people on this call know who he is. He was the person who took a huge amount of series of images of human beings and animals in motion, and was in the mid-1880s working at the University of Philadelphia, where it seems Levison encountered him a couple of times. And something came across an envelope, weirdly enough, on my very first day in here, at about 10 to 5, was this photograph, which, as it turns out, from the notes that go with it, is a photograph of Edward Muybridge, taken with the Brainerd Levison snapshot camera. And on it, he says, actually, Muybridge is looking at a bunch of snapshot photographs. You can see he is looking down at a pile of something in his hand. So this is Muybridge on the left. This on the right is a friend of Levison's, and next to him is one of Muybridge's assistants. But we can also see that this box here, there's a set of stairs in the background. Even this plank, and perhaps this kind of looks like could be black paint or something similar there. These are all things that he's using at the time this is taken in the June of 1885, which I've been able to verify with Muybridge expert Marta Braun in Canada. So basically, we are seeing behind the screen. We've seen lots of pictures of the front of the screen. This is, as far as I know, the only informal behind the scenes picture that exists of Muybridge at work. And all because he was toting around his little partially disguised snapshot camera. And I suspect he went away and he had a bit of a think about this, going, well, Muybridge has this great big sort of all loads of cameras next to each other. It's a massive, complex undertaking. What if you could kind of do it all in one thing, just like in one camera, something smaller, more compact again? Now, I've kind of always read that essentially very little remains of what Levison got up to. As in, there are some newspaper reports in Brooklyn newspapers, one or two other places, of him giving talks around 1888, but that's it. No camera, no images, no nothing. In fact, even today, I saw somebody who tweets about pre-cinema history tweeting out that, there's nothing known of the camera. Well, one of the first things to see here was a set of 3 glass plates. Number 1, number 2, number 3, which he said were shot with his moving picture camera. Well, this was extremely exciting, as you can imagine. Although, when I flipped them over to be positives, what became clear is that's not the same girl as that girl. It certainly doesn't seem to be the same moment, does it? You can even see the shadows are different in the background. So I suspect that these were 3 pictures perhaps got put together later when things were being passed to the museum. I don't know. Maybe it has some other meaning. But still, this is from the camera. That's exciting. And then gradually looking through other materials, found something, found one or two later articles, and found something which Leveson seems to use for some sort of exhibition. Maybe it was at Brooklyn Institute, I don't know, which has a series of 3 pictures of a boy called Victor Grimwood, and a man tossing a stick. I think his name was Edgar. I think his surname was Edgar. So, well, let's take a look at that boy jumping. These are just the 3 pictures, but still, it is capturing a full movement of some kind. And with this came a very important clue, which is what he actually says on this little exhibition thing is that he was only putting 3 plates in. He could take 12. He actually says, a trial of my moving picture camera, 3 plates placed at 12, 4, 8 in the wheel and exposed during 1 revolution in less than a second. So what he's saying is he didn't do the whole lot just to test out the idea. He just put 1 in every 4 places. So what you saw is the action of 12 frames, as it were, but only 3 of them were taken, which is more impressive because clearly the system is working. And I've tried jumping off a chair in the corridor upstairs quite a few times and timing myself with a stopwatch, and it took about half a second. I've also tried tossing a stick, and that takes about half. There's the up and back chance, about half a second. So what we're saying is he could capture 12 images in half a second, roughly 24 frames a second. Theoretically, if you had a lot more frames, the speed that movies are shot at. Just an interesting coincidence. But still, there was thing about, what about the camera? What about the camera? I really want to see the camera. It appeared that the camera was around. Now, the camera proved elusive, not really because anything was wrong, but because Shannon and I both, in a sense, stared at it and didn't see it for a while, because it wasn't what we were expecting, the size we were expecting, and in all sorts of ways. So it took time to go, okay, this is the camera, which we saw last Friday. In another extremely exciting moment. A moment which this, I think, properly portrays. It also gives you some sense of size of the beast. Let's look at some slightly more sensible pictures. Here we go. You can see there's a black thing on top, which is a kind of homemade viewfinder, largely just made out of cardboard, in fact, but that's you can look down it and see roughly what's going to be shot by the lens, which is underneath. You can also see various other elements of it. Well, let me take a little guided tour here. So we can see there's this shaft here, which is operating a lot of it. We can see there's various electrical connections going on. And around the back here, there's a crank reel. The actual crank handle has presumably been removed at some point to be used for something else, but you can see there was something there which you would have turned. And then that turned the whole shaft, which meant that inside a wheel went round, which had the images on, and it also fired some electrical contacts. And coming around the other side, opening it up, we see this, a stack of plate holders. So you could put a little glass plate in each one of these. And then you can also see on the right-hand part, this is where they were slipped in. So you could like put a plate in, turn the wheel, put the next one in, load it up. And even inside, you can see there are numbers written for each plate holder. Though there are 2 sets of numbers, which are different, which I can't make any sense of, but there are. So maybe they found the original numbers didn't work so well that they needed to do it again. And then at the front here, well, at the top, you can see the viewfinder, the large circle. The smaller circle is the actual lens hidden behind there. In fact, you can even see, just about see there, that's me reflected in the lens taking the photograph. And what's below it, this thing that looks a bit like a razor blade, is actually part of a shutter. So what it would actually do was it was essentially shut and then open and then shut again. It would slide across one way and slide across the other way. And it was operated by electromagnets. That's the electrical wiring that you see. And I suspect in this, he was inspired by the work that Muybridge had been doing. He'd been using electromagnetically powered shutters in his work. So I'm figuring that's what he's up to. But he's managed to put it all together, of course, into something considerably more compact. It may not look compact, but that is, relatively speaking, for the job it's doing. And he'd even thought as far as this weird bag thing you can see here at the side. Shannon and I puzzled over this for a while because photographers and indeed cinematographers using film very often have like bags you can put your hand in, so you can sort of load up canisters and stuff like that in like a dark space even when you're out in the field. But this didn't have an entry point for a hand. But I had a read of his patent, his uncompleted patent, but it's all there. And the idea seems to be you can kind of use it kind of glove-like and sort of push your hand in. And I'm imagining take a plate out, maybe put it at the bottom of the bulb, put a new plate in, so you don't have to go back to a dark room to load things up again. So, you know, quite clever. So you could have, there were 36 plate holders there roughly, so you could have 3 go-arounds of 3 complete cycles. He doesn't appear to have done that. He appears to have been happy to just test it and leave it. And here we can actually see, you might notice these are electrical connections. That little screw thing there is moving a contact along 12 electrical connections to fire the shutters 12 times. I wanted to show you this because this was a really curious thing. When we took out all these plate holders to count them, the one in the middle, by the way, that actually is a piece of glass which had chemicals on. So it's kind of, it was exposed to light at some point. That's why you've seen it change. The other ones are just empty. But the funny thing is, a few of them had grass on them. Now you've seen that all the sequences were shot in his back garden. So I can only assume that somewhere along the way in doing all these things, some of the grass got in. And it's quite a curious thing to think, well, we're looking at the grass from Wallace Gould Levison's back garden in the October of 1887, whilst he was shooting all these tests. And here it is now. It's a very sort of strange, direct connection with the past. And just to show how very clever Levison was, I want to show you something that was in his patent, because he was doing all this with glass plates. But in it, he suggests, well, you can use the same basic shutter system and all of this, and even movement system, with a roll of film. That there is one reel leading through to a take-up reel. It was only paper film at this point in time. Celluloid film hadn't quite come out, but he saw that possibility. He didn't do it, but it's there, it's described. So you can really say this is somebody on the cusp of things. I think that's a fair description. Let me take you forward a little bit to somebody else who I've often asked myself, was this man a blue sky thinker or was he not? My definition of blue sky thinker really, in terms of moving pictures, is somebody who was thinking about moving pictures before they ever saw a kinetoscope and 35mm film and basically had some idea how the whole thing could be achieved. And I've been back and forth about this man, Charles Francis Jenkins, a man subject to a great deal of controversy, as indeed William Friese-Greene has been over the years, which is another reason I'm curious about him. I'm not going to get too much into the controversy between him and a man called Thomas Armat. They invented something together, they fell out, and literally their argument carried on in the annals of the Smithsonian for, well, about 30 years. And there's hundreds of pages of correspondence relating to this that I've been looking at. But I want to talk about happier times before all of that occurred, when he was trying to come up with something. So there was, now we're talking about somewhere around 1892, 1893, we've got celluloid film in rolls for taking still photographs with, which obviously you could repurpose for other uses. And this was the camera he came up with. Doesn't really look much. Looking at this box, here's the interesting part of it. And also, it's a, you know, you can't see any lens at the front. It seems a little bit odd. This is the inside. So you can see things could be rolled from one place to another, the film. You may notice looking at that roller, there's no sprockets, there's nothing to hold the film with holes in because the film didn't have any holes in it. And this here is a ring of lenses. Now there would have been 10 lenses, some of them seem to have been unscrewed. Maybe they got reused in another machine because he built many devices that used this sort of system. So the idea was, instead of the film stopping and starting like I described, the film moved continuously the lenses are evolved, and at a certain point, as they go past the open aperture, the speed is equal and a picture is taken. And it works. This actually works. That the lenses move with the film actually does work as a way of taking pictures, and indeed was used at certain times by him later and by others for high-speed photography. Because if you imagine you want to take hundreds of pictures a second, imagine trying to stop and start a film hundreds of times a second. It's actually easier if the film never stops moving. Now, we don't have a lot of records of this, but we do know, because in 1894, in photographic publications, these images were published of somebody, it says putting the shot, although I've good reason to believe this is literally just somebody throwing a rock. It's not anything quite as sophisticated as that. But the point is, there you can see a sequence of somebody throwing. He claimed he's only actually reproduced 1 in 3 images. But that's all we really have. That's the only record we really have of what he got up to. Or is it? Because there's something very intriguing in one of the boxes in the photographic history collection, and it's this. Our film work since 1895, Samples and Relics, comes from a guy called Eberhard Schneider, was donated by his widow, comes with no real information about what it is, why it was put together. The name Miro Vitae, you see, was the name of his company and the projector that he had. It looks like it's been put together for some kind of display in some exhibition. I still don't know what. Most of it, you hopefully now can recognize as 35mm films, lots of strips of 35mm film, but there are some other things in it that are not, all of which caught my eye. And the one that most caught my eye is the one smack in the middle. What the hell is this? It's film with no sprocket holes in it. It's unperforated. It's wider. I think it's about 1 7/8 of an inch wide. It's got 1-inch square frames on it. It's got all these weird markings up the side. What these are the result of electrical discharge from static. Because it's a real problem, especially in the early days. And lots of early people working with film mentioned this, that the effect of unwinding the film very rapidly created static, and you get these kind of lightning-like marks on the film. It was a problem also for the people, Eastman, making the film when he pulled it off the glass table, not to get static. So that makes me think, well, this could be really quite early. And it also makes me start to wonder, well, could this be something to do with Jenkins? Because there are various stories attached to him of him filming somebody dancing, and this looks like somebody dancing. So yesterday, I went and had another look at it, and on my mobile phone, quite literally in less than 15 minutes, made this. There, in a very rough and ready fashion, is what was being filmed. It said, he got in a bit of trouble for what he filmed. That's regarded as a bit scandalous. This might make sense of the story. If it is Jenkins, because I saw all this, I was really happy, thought, I think this could well be early Jenkins film. I can't see what on earth else it could be. With his camera, the film moves continuously and all of that. And then I went and looked back at this sheet again and went, what is that? And this time I was looking at these marks on the left and on the right. Every frame, halfway down, there's a mark. Yep. And the frame is in the middle. So it's almost as if they put it in the middle to avoid whatever's happening at the edges there. And it's like something is touching the film a bit. Something is causing friction against the film every frame. So can it be the continuous moving thing? Or is it another thing? Well, he said he had been doing other things early on as well, which was widely disbelieved. But maybe he actually was. I don't have any idea about this. I just put this out there as this is the nature of research. You find something, you put two together and make 4, and then wonder whether it was 5 or 3 or 1, and you don't really know. And I'm going to leave Charles Francis Jenkins there, although there's so much more to say about him, and I'm going to finish by talking about the least known name of all. Not that you've probably be going, yay! Well, it's called Leveson the moment I mentioned him anyway. Although somebody online will be, I think Deek, who's online, I know will be. I want to talk about Nicolay Nelson. Nicolay Nelson, sadly, I can't even show you a picture of him, haven't found one yet. So instead, I'm going to show you an advert from, I think it's 1905, from the local paper in Waukegan, Illinois, where he had a machine shop. It's automobile repairing, a speciality. So you wouldn't necessarily think this is somebody to do with moving pictures. Actually, I could name for you a few people who are involved with automobiles and moving pictures. I think Charles Francis Jenkins was one of them. It's not as weird as it sounds if you've got the right kind of mind. Now, Nicolai Nelson was born in Norway, came over to America as a young man, first went to Chicago, then apparently Waukegan, and joined a company there, a company which also had connections with Edward Arnett, who was an early figure in American film, but I'm not going to talk about him because this isn't about him. This is about something which was in one of the cabinets when we opened it, and to be honest, was only a sort of secondary thought in my mind to look at all, until I saw it and thought, oh, well, I have to go and have a look at this. It's a very cute and unusual looking device for taking moving pictures. At the front and the back with this little crank handle. And this is what it's like inside. Not what you'd probably be expecting in a moving picture camera. And that's because this isn't designed to hold film. This is designed to hold a circular disc and to write a spiral of images upon it. So you have that lens, and the system rotates the disc, rotates the circle, whilst gradually moving it sideways, and records a spiral. Really, really clever. Still looked in very good condition. Now, tantalizingly, the records did say that it came with some discs, but the discs weren't there, and they weren't quite where we expected them to be either. And I thought, they've got to be there. So I'd found like a contact print of one of them. And a few days ago, we were in the Photograph History store, and I just said, well, should you ever look at the old card index, which I know Shannon has defended being removed in favour of the computerised version, and with good reason. We went to the card index, pulled out the cards, and I said, well, what does this mean, this reference? She said, well, it means this room, and it means it's that cabinet, it means it's that shelf. Dug around a bit, found the cabinet, went to the shelf. There is a box with 7 discs in it, negatives and positives, because the same idea, you have a negative disc, you print it onto another disc, same as the film. When I say a negative disc, that's kind of what it would look like. You can see the circles going in, but more meaningful, perhaps show you a bit of a close-up of what's on that disc. On the positive version, here it is. So the locomotive going by. And what's quite nice about this section is you can kind of see, well, there's the beginning, it comes into shot, there it is. Then you see the goods wagon, then passenger, and then there's the very back of it as it disappears out of the shot. So, I don't know how long that would take, probably not a very long time. It was not a long train, I don't know, 15 seconds, it should do it, I would have thought. And each one of these loops is 43 frames. Don't ask me why 43, it doesn't divide into 360 easily, does it? But it is 43. So 4 lots of them is about 160, 170 frames. So yeah, I don't know, I'm making a guess that maybe it was taken about 10 frames a second, but then it depends how fast you turn the handle, doesn't it? It's not an exact science. So let me show you 1 or 2 other things, like, okay, this. Here's a woman drawing a cat on some sort of chalkboard or chalk, I don't know, some kind of black surface. Another suitable subject for a short movie. Over here, we have what seems to be perhaps all of a family blowing soap bubbles. Now, I don't know so much about the origin of these. It's that they seem to have come via somebody who probably worked for the company. And at first they think, oh, these are technical tests. No, they're not technical tests. These are just home movies. These are just, I think, just him taking movies of his family and things around him. These are people cycling up and down the main street, I assume, in Waukegan. There's a couple of ones of people riding bicycles. And also this one shows the limitations of the system, because if I come out, you'll see what's happening. So Round one, fine. Round two, fine. Round three, still good. Round four, well, getting slightly overlap. Well, loads of overlap. By the time you get to the sixth circle of hell here, everything's squishing up over one another, and it obviously is not going to work at all. That is a limitation of how this works. 8-inch discs, and the pictures themselves were 9.5 millimeters by 11.5 millimeters, which is about half an inch by 0.4 of an inch. So less than a quarter of the size of a 35 millimeter frame. And he was doing this in 1896, 1897. So just as the movies are kicking off, completely alternative idea. And I did wonder, was this just a little thing they did there and a couple of people had them or something? You know, did it ever really move past the test stage? And digging around and following a few leads, I found, oh yeah, it did. For a little while anyway, at the end of it, for Christmas of 1897, it was being sold by E&H.T. Anthony and Co. I think the biggest photographic suppliers in America, were they at that moment? Is that fair to say? Yeah. So, you know, that's a success if you've got them to take on your product, being sold as the Spiral. Makes more than 200 pictures. Well, I wouldn't recommend attempting on 200 pictures from what we've seen, but in theory, it is simple and easily handled. Light and compact, price complete, including projecting lens, lamp, and 1/2 dozen plates, only $36. $36, very, very broadly speaking, is maybe, I don't know, $1,200 today, which may sound like a lot, but I was just thinking to myself, when VHS camcorders came out in the late 80s, early 90s, they were thousands, as I recall, in the money of 30 years ago. So this is not actually really an outrageous amount of money to have a home movie system. And there's another thing that suddenly occurred to me. Oh, sorry, let me just explain what you're seeing here. This is like how you would project. So what you've got, so that's a gas mantle there because you used gas to create the light of one sort or another, and it's got a reflector to reflect it back through. So that's what it's showing you there. And you get that, some of that, not the gas, but some of that with it. And I just thought, well, hang on a second, if this was like being sold in the Christmas of 1897, I think that makes it possibly the earliest home movie system to ever go on the market. I mean, certainly in the United States, possibly really in the world. And I mean, one can argue back and forth about what constitutes a home movie system. I mean, people could have used 35mm things that were around that day. There were some simple ones. But the point is, you had to use celluloid film. And this was nitrocellulose, which was highly flammable. You know, it was dangerous in a professional context. Imagine in a home context, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, you know, letting people at home use very dangerous materials, especially with lit gas. Glass, much safer. Also cheaper, actually cheaper to use a glass disc than a roll of film, cheaper. So it made a lot of sense. I don't know that it was a great success. They did all right out of it, because I read an article in which they'd created an improved version that could take more images and was going to be $25, but I don't know that it ever came to market. And the idea did not entirely disappear, the idea of doing things on disc. Other people did it, and it probably reached its apotheosis, weirdly enough, post the First World War, with this, which there is one of also in the collection here. It's the urban spirograph. It really is like a sort of, you know, it looks a bit like a record for music, only it's images. So it's a bigger disc, smaller images more tightly packed together, better resolution. They did finally have non-flammable materials this could be made of, so much safer in the home. So flexible, not glass, but still essentially similar kind of idea. If you look at it, they haven't got more sophisticated. It's still just a line going in like that. They just had the good common sense to make sure when you get to the middle, they don't overlap. But that's really the main tweak going on there. Various other things to make the system more stable. So extraordinarily, 25 years later was when it was sold the most. This was kind of partially designed by a guy called Theodore Brown in Britain, but Charles Urban was a producer, entrepreneur, worked both sides of the Atlantic, selling this and many other things. So that's kind of my mad, crazy dash through three entirely different alternative universes, as it were. So one in which somebody's making moving pictures with little glass plates in his back garden. Another one where somebody says, well, why does the film have to stop? Why can't the film just move all the time? And you could take pictures like that. And then somebody else going, well, why do you need film at all? Wouldn't it be better to just use a glass disc? They're really cheap, they're really safe. Why don't we do that? these are just kind of three examples of kind of, well, I would describe it as blue sky thinking, of looking at things an alternative way. And I don't have the time to go into all of it now, but I would say this even extended at the beginning of the film industry, when we didn't need to end up with 35mm and the way everything was set for donkey's years, but commercial forces pushed it that way. Anyway, that's enough from me. Please ask any questions.
Are there any questions in the chat? Let's see.
Oh, he was saying. Any questions from anybody about anything? Yes.
With Francis doing things to camera,
Yeah.
with the rotating lenses, have I understood correctly that you have lag moments or frames between the exposures?
Well, without actually trying to do it again, I don't know. I think they would probably come very close on each other, I would have thought. The way he's arranged it. Yeah. And he, as I say, he did make different versions with different amounts of lenses and so for different uses. But we don't have a lot of, well, so far much of all these different things, but there are several cameras here in the collection.
So there's one more trivial question.
Yes.
With the circular plate at the end, how do you know where to start?
How do you know where to start when you're shooting with the circular plate? It has a clever little thing in it. I mean, I just checked this up looking at the patent last night. It has a clever little thing where you can sort of basically do a release, just take it back to the first position, so that it always moves from the same starting place, basically. And I imagine the spirograph, they did something, but the spirograph was, I don't know, I think that was more for showing things that had already been made, whereas this was actually shooting your own things. It was not the only, it was not the later there were other things where people tried to do this on glass.
Ryan Linfelman asked, well, he's excited about your research skills and dedication. I wonder what you're thinking about for next steps. There are obviously so many opportunities here for new scholarship. Where do you think you'll start?
Well, my supervisor couldn't be online tonight, so luckily she's not here to see all of this. No, I'm joking, but I would say my supervisor would say, could you finish your PhD before you go down an awful lot of these avenues? And I think that would be an entirely justifiable comment. That said, it's been immensely useful in the sense of, you know, looking at somebody else, for instance, using glass plates and circular plates, because there is some evidence that William Friese-Greene was trying to shoot his images in a circle on glass plates. Whether it was literally just circle, whether it's a spiral, is a bit fuzzy. I mean, I hope I can find some more. I may not, but it's just interesting to see these ideas bouncing about, and to also see the idea of snapshot photography, just fast photography, stepping into motion pictures. And it's also interesting to me in the Charles Francis Jenkins story, which I've not said very much about because it's such a big other story. Another figure who has been much misunderstood, some of which is their own fault, and some of which is the fault of perhaps poor job done by former historians, I would say. And so it's very interesting to see that comparison, to see those things happening in different places. Yes.
It feels like you presented sort of three visions for, as you said, different kind of setup for what film could have been. And that third one, that was really intriguing, the camera that also serves as a projector, with the sort of home movie setup being the goal of that, and a different kind of, completely different kind of commercial setup to what, I suppose, what actually succeeded in the years that followed. Could you talk a little bit more about the other two? What do you think were the visions of those people with their machines? Did they anticipate commercial cinema in the way that it emerged, or was there something, did their cameras and their ways of doing things point to a different way of thinking about moving picture? And I'm curious, because you sort of mentioned, you hinted at the sort of scandalousness of some of the material that, what was the second person's name?
C. Francis Jenkins.
Jenkins was taking. So, what does that say about what he thought this could be? And also, were scientists interested in this? Maybe that's a separate question.
Okay, well, there's a lot of questions there. Well, these are different sorts of people, because really, here you have, I would say, obviously they're all inventors, but you've got a scientist, an inventor, and a mechanic, if I wanted to describe them primarily. Levinson was absolutely primarily a scientist. And he was, I think, curious about this from the scientific possibility of capturing movement. So like I say, from a snapshot to capturing a load of stuff. But, he was doing fun things, wasn't he? He was getting kids to jump off boxes in his back garden. He wasn't trying to capture something scientific. So he was obviously thinking that it could be used for all sorts of things in recording life. But his interest was
influenced by Muybridge and that.
Oh, I would say clearly he was. I mean, the fact that he met Muybridge, we know at least twice, makes me think, and when he was at work in the University of Pennsylvania, it makes me think that he really did look at that and go, couldn't we do it with, a smaller setup? Because, he had this massive setup which had all sorts of people to help, but he could do this camera on his own and achieve, not dissimilar results, in fact. So I think that was his interest. C. Francis Jenkins was an inventor. He took out, I think, over 300 patents in his life. He was a lifelong inventor in all sorts of fields, including to do with automotive power and to do with ideas for early television as well. In fact, the very same year he created that camera, he also proposed a very sort of basic early method for transmitting images electronically. So he was thinking about those things as well. So if I'm right, and that film is a Jenkins film of that woman dancing, fair to say he's looking at commercial uses, isn't he? And later he worked with somebody else to create a projector that could project the kinetoscope films. And this is where the whole fuss and disaster began, because he then obviously moved to co-creating something that used 35mm. But actually that was not his original idea. And later, I would say he tried to, in a sense, he did himself down, because he wanted to be very much attached to that, because that was viewed as the beginning of cinema. But the point is, he had another idea, which was also a good idea. He'd already done before he met this other guy. And in a sense, sort of downplayed that to be attached to the big story of cinema. And somebody like Nicolay Nelson is like I tell you, he's just, some guy with a good mechanical mind who's thinking up, all sorts of different stuff in his life, working with whatever makes him some money. And what's slightly fascinating, when you look at what he built, you didn't need to have moving pictures on film to have done that. You didn't need to have got to the point that you had films being projected. You could have done that before. Mechanical working out, it's just, that's just mechanics. You could have done any time. Glass plates have been knocking around since forever. It actually could have been invented before. But the impetus of there being this commercial world of moving pictures, I guess, is what stimulated him to try and actually make it. I mean, maybe he thought of it before. I don't know. No idea. Oh, will yours be the first dissertation turned into a film? Why not? Yeah, good question. Good question. Hopefully, in some sense, yes, down the line. Yeah, because obviously I don't like to forsake my the filmmaking side of things.
I just thought you would like to know, while you're still there in Washington, that there were 7 patents for glass plate cinematography before 1900 and about 30 before 1911. That does not include Nicolay Nelson, whom I've never heard of. But a lot of people thought glass plate cinematography was a very good market to try and open up. In the first place, it wasn't flammable like the celluloid film was, so it wasn't dangerous to people. In the second place, there was a huge installed basis of people who had worked with glass plate photography and knew how to handle and develop glass plates. And thirdly, it was very economical. It was estimated at one point in Germany that 11 meters of celluloid film cost about 8 marks 80 pence. To get a positive out of that, you were talking about 17 marks 60 pence. To get the same 576 frames on a glass plate cost 15 pence for the negative and 15 for the, so it's talking about 17 marks 60 against 30 pence for the glass plate costs. So there's a lot of motivation there to follow Kodak, actually, which invented a new popular market for photography amongst the various cinematographic inventors to try and penetrate that world.
That's fantastic. I mean, that's such a price differential. That's quite mind-boggling. Yeah, you can see absolutely why people would have liked to have done it. Yeah.
I've got to read one from Art Malella. He asks, next steps, will yours be the first PhD dissertation that turned into a film?
Yes.
Why not?
Well, as I was saying, in the long run, that would be nice. Again, I think my supervisors would like me to just actually write the PhD. Sorry, what was your question?
My question is, was there any sort of discussion in the photography journals at the time about these different processes, methods, advantages and disadvantages?
Well, the question was there a lot of discussion in the photography journals about all these different processes and advantages and disadvantages? Because the answer is yes, absolutely, constantly. Week by week, month by month, all sorts of things were coming up and pros and cons being discussed of different materials and different mechanisms, and somebody saying they perfected it, and obviously they never were perfect. They were usually very imperfect. Yeah. And it took quite a while before it, because since photography journals were about the only place where this sat at first, and then gradually sort of moved over into other spheres. So yeah. Huge amount, and I glean a huge amount of material from photographic journals.
We're technically out of time. However, there are a few other comments and questions in the chat if you want to take them on.
Oh, here we go. Right, hang on, I'm going to have to look at this properly. You see, this paragraph goes out to a home market. Would it perhaps naturally for the magic lantern? Yeah, another optical devices. Yeah. Oh, there is a digital restoration of one of Urban spirographs. I would indeed like to see that. I have been thinking about how could we reanimate these discs. So I'd be interested to see clues as to how people have gone about that. I have a very simple thought about it, but I think it's a simple thought that would still be quite difficult to achieve. But it wouldn't be wonderful to see those things in motion again, especially because it's such an obscure thing to be in some, it's not New York City, it's, a not very big town that not many people know of, and people doing their things. Anything else? Oh, sorry, I can see Aileen has her hand up. Can you unmute?
Hi, Peter. Great talk. There's just more things in the chat, but at the top of the chat that you're not answering.
Could you read this out?
You mentioned that the kinetoscope debuted in 1894. However, sources say that the kinetoscope debuted to the public at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences on May 1893. That was just the thing about the kinetoscope. Can you give years for these devices? Were they before or after Le Prince?
Okay, well, in terms of the kinetoscope, it was first shown at the Brooklyn Institute. It was first properly demonstrated there, and Wallace Gould Levison was in the audience because he was a senior person. He was somebody who was part of the physics department of the Brooklyn Institute himself. So he would have been there, he would have actually seen that. But that was not really public. That was the physics department of the Brooklyn Institute. It actually public, paying punters, had to wait till the April of 1894, as I recall. All of these things are after Laplace. Is the no, actually, sorry, that's not quite true. That's not true because Levison was doing this in 1887. So yeah, that was actually before Laplace succeeded in shooting any kind of a sequence with a single lens device. So actually, that it is before. Yeah.
So that was Jim Deutsch and Mark Shubin questions. And then Steve Lonker, at what point do you see early filmmakers engaging viewers through visual storytelling and visual structure?
Oh, wow. Well, that's an absolutely massive sort of film history and film theory question. I think I'm actually going to dodge that and not answer it at all because it's just too big a question. And what constitutes storytelling? I would say there was storytelling in some of the very, very first things that were ever shot on a commercial basis in whatever country. But that's a kind of discuss at great length.
I think those were just the questions I thought you were missing there at the top. I think you caught everything else.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, well done.
Well, if those are all the questions.
There were a few others in the chat. I don't know whether we should.
Well, I think we've been through
you
most
see
of
them all?
Let me just double check. Oh, dates for the devices. Dates for the devices. Well, yes, just to reiterate, the work that Wallace Gould Levison did with his motion picture camera was done in the autumn of 1887. He did later use it again, I think in a patent suit, just to prove that it worked. So he did operate it again, although we don't seem to have those materials. So it did still work some years later, but he used it in 1887 and was working on it from 1886. Charles Francis Jenkins, from the look of it, was probably starting working on something with moving pictures and film at the end of 1892 into 1893, as far as I can see from materials I've seen here. And Nicolay Nelson was applying for a patent in the middle of 1897, which appears to be absolutely identical to the finished item, from which I take it that quite a lot of work had gone into it by that point. So I'd say he was working on it from 1896, at a guess.
All right, I think we'll close there. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.